Good morning. Last day of class. Wow. That is wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So we were talking on Friday about models of population growth, and we left off introducing the logistic model. All right, and the logistic model, basically, it's logarithmic growth where you have number of individuals over time, and sort of lag, then exponential, and then it sort of plateaus. What is that plateau representative of? What is this sort of area where that red line is? That red line represents the number of individuals for what? Abby? Carrying capacity. All right. So an ecosystem or community, whatever we're talking about, it has a certain carrying capacity. All right. And in a logistic model, sort of you have a lag period or a period of adjustment where it has very not exponential growth, right, but growth nonetheless. And then as adaptations occur, the population becomes acclimated. You get a exponential growth phase, which is in between here, right? And then as the population approaches carrying capacity, the birth rate, the population growth rate decreases. Okay? All right, so here's your paramecium population in the lab and our Daphnia waterfeet population in the lab. Okay, and what do you notice about the Daphnia one? So really, what happens to theirs? Let's follow, this is their trend. What happened?
Population spiked, like increased greatly and then decreased.
Okay, what do you think the carrying capacity is for that population? Give me a number, a rough number. For the Daphnia, it would be. You think it's up here? Here, right? Sort of in this area. Right about 15. Okay. So why does the population overshoot the carrying capacity? Keeps reproducing. All right, and some populations do this. Some populations will overshoot the carrying capacity, and then there's factors that are in play that will regulate that and bring the population back down to the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity for the paramecium is probably estimated around where? What number on that graph? Around probably 900, 950, right? That population never reaches carrying capacity of the ecosystem. Probably due for competition of resources, right? Lack of space, etc. All right, we're going to talk about. All right, so some populations will overshoot carrying capacity, which is K, before settling down to a relatively stable density. All right, and some populations actually fluctuate greatly and make it difficult to define K. Right, and movements or changes in population depending upon predators, resource availability, etc. Okay, so this logistic model is a problem because it will occur in ideal conditions. But are conditions ever really ideal, especially in real populations? No, not really. Okay, so although we talk about like this sort of happening in the lab or when you remove all different circumstances, but that doesn't necessarily fit real populations. All right. But we use this model to estimate the critical size below which populations may become extinct. All right. So we talk about critical size, especially with endangered species, polar bears, for example. We have to have a critical size, a certain size of population that can help sustain those numbers, all right? Because what's going to happen? If we have too small a population, there's not going to be enough genetic diversity, there's going to be problems, and then eventually that population may become extinct. All right, questions on the logistic model? All right, so we talked about the exponential model, logistic models. What does this have to do with real life populations? All right, we're going to talk about life history. All right, this comprises the traits that affect its schedule of reproduction and survival. All right, so a human's life history begins at conception, right? They become a zygote, they develop, right? An individual is born, and we go from diploid stage, right? 2N zygote, develop until maturity, until puberty, where now that diploid individual is going to begin to produce gametes, haploid cells, which will fulfill the reproductive cycles, right? That life history of development and not in sexual immaturity up until puberty time, average age of 13 or so. Okay, that's when reproduction begins. That comprises human life history. Okay, we talk about how often an organism reproduces. Right, mice, rabbits, right? They have high reproductive rates. Humans, twice a lifetime, 2, 3, maybe 2 or 3 times a lifetime, maybe less. Right, but we talk about how often they're able to reproduce. Okay. And then how many offspring are produced during each reproductive cycle. All right, how many the litters, how many, if an animal does have litters, okay, how many individuals are within that litter, etc. Okay, this will affect basically the reproduction and survival of the species. But we know that organisms live in a finite resource area. Okay? When population increases, goes over carrying capacity, there's a competition for resources. Okay? So there has to be trade-offs that are made. You sacrifice reproductive viability or reproductive success for survival of an individual. And so on. Right? This is a selective pressure. What's going to happen over time? Selective pressure, what type of selection am I talking about? Natural selection. So eventually those that survive will pass on and hopefully pass on their genes and become reproductively successful the next stage, right? The next time. Okay? Example, some plants produce large number of small seeds, ensuring that at least some of them will grow and eventually reproduce, while other plants produce relatively few number of seeds, but in large amounts to hopefully that success. Example, dandelion versus the Brazil nut tree. All right, so you have the dandelion, those, they're everywhere, right? Soon the maple trees will produce their seedlings, and they'll end up in my gutter. Eventually I have little maple tree seedlings. I swear I could cultivate thousands of maple trees a year if I wanted to, and so on. But the Brazil nut tree, a little less, and they help to ensure success in how they've. All right. Other types of plants produce a moderate number of seeds, right? But they produce a large store of energy that will help seedlings become established, right? So think about fruits, okay? Think about an avocado. How many seeds does an avocado have? 1, right? Each one of those fruits is 1 seed, which will eventually give rise to, hopefully, an avocado tree. It's going to take a while, right? But the seed is there to help ensure success of that seed until it becomes stable. Okay? Those selective pressures can be based upon 2 different things. Whether or not it's density dependent or density independent. When I talk about density, what am I referring to? Population density, so the number of individuals in a given area, which is directly related to what's the maximum number of individuals in a given area that can sustain that number. That's carrying capacity. So if it's density dependent, it's also known as K selection. K is for carrying capacity. Right? So carrying capacity selection based upon density. Okay? So this will select for life history traits that are sensitive to population density. And this might be related to competition for resources, etc. R selection, okay, R refers to what? Reproductive rates, right? So R selection, or density independent, that selective pressure selects traits to be passed on that are related to reproductive rate. All right, they have to maximize reproduction. Ashley, you okay? Okay. Might want to get that checked. All right, so density independent populations. Okay, so R selection, birth rate and death rate do not change with population density. Okay? So, when I was in 8th grade, my 8th grade science teacher had a bright idea about let's teach the kids to take care of animals. So she went out and she got a bunch of pet mice. Okay? We didn't know what was going on. We're 8th graders. It was mice in a cage. Okay? All of a sudden, there's 1, 2, 3 pregnant mice. Then there's 5, 6, 7 litters. Those litters grow up and they become mature. And now we have a colony of mice in our 8th grade lab. Oops. They're all in some little enclosure, no bigger than this table. And now there's what started with a dozen mice, now are 5 dozen mice. What has not happened? Without taking the male or males away and them competing with one another, if I left one male in there, okay, and he had his run with all the ladies, okay, he'd be happy. The females would, grow to sexual maturity and nature would take its course. Okay? What's not going to change? The reproductive rate is not going to change. Even though they're in this little enclosure, they will continue to reproduce as long as I take away whatever territorial competition there is for the male. Okay? If I just left a female in there, or females in there with the male, he'd have his way. Okay? That is an example of a density independent. Birth rate, death rate, sort of constant. Okay? Density dependent populations, birth rates fall and death rates rise as the population goes up. So, going back to my mouse situation, here I have my mice. I don't take any of the males out. Okay? They are born, they grow up, they become sexually mature. What's going to happen when what do you think is going to happen when male mice become sexually mature? What are they going to compete for? Females. Okay? Because what's the drive? The drive is to produce, pass on their genes, and the most fit individual produces litters. Okay? When they do that, when they compete for females, what do you think the competition is?
Fighting.
It's fighting. What does it end with? Death. Okay? So, that is one way. Okay? Female mice also have a behavior of consuming, cannibalizing their litters if there's there's too much. There's not enough resources. Okay? There's too much, there's not enough resources, there's too many mice in an area, they will cannibalize their litters. Right? That is a density dependent situation. Okay? Based upon the number of individuals in a given area. Okay? So here, we have the graph, all right, showing in red your density independent death rate. It's just death rate's gonna stay the same. No increase, no decrease, regardless of what the population is. Okay? And then in blue, you have your density dependent birth rate. Okay? So some of which is density independent, density dependent. All right, so what's going to happen? This helps control the changes in birth rate and death rate. Okay, will help control overall population, right, size. And we already went over this when we talked about birth rate, death rate, and how they affect population size. All right. This is just giving you a background of what the changes are in that birth rate and death rate and what they're dependent upon. So, mechanisms. Density-dependent birth and death rates are an example of negative feedback that regulates population growth. What is negative feedback? The cause of something, right? There's some type of stimulus which causes something to happen. And the effect of that action counteracts the original cause, the original stimulus. Okay? So, if birth rate goes up and population size goes up, what eventually is going to happen? If birth rates are high, population's high, eventually birth rate's going to go down and mortality rate's going to go up, right? Because we only have a certain carrying capacity for each biome, each ecosystem, or the biosphere in general, all right? What affects this? Competition for resources, territoriality, disease, predation, toxic waste, and other intrinsic factors. We're going to go. So we've touched on this. I have talked about this as we've gone through this population chapter. Competition for resources is important. Food availability, water. Food's not available. What's going to happen to death rate? Jenny, it's going to increase. Okay. If there's plenty of resources available, such as after the Industrial Revolution, what's going to happen to birth rate? It's going to go up. What's going to happen to death rate? It's going to go down. What's going to happen to overall population size? Let's go up. Okay? So the next few slides are very repetitive. More of an explanation, and you'll see how this, okay? So, competition for resources. Here you see a cornfield. What are they competing for? Sunlight. What else? Soil, right? Minerals, nutrients, water in the soil. So they're grown together. That's why and you look in the back of a seed packet, right? You're planting a garden this spring. You look in the back of the seed packet. There says plant seedlings 3 to 4 inches apart. For whatever it might be. Why? They're going to compete for resources. You put them too close together, these plants aren't going to thrive. Okay? And that may result in lower fruit production, right? Lower, what you look at, lower birth rate in that case. Toxic wastes, okay, produced by a population can accumulate in the environment, contributing to density-dependent regulation of population size. And here they show you yeast. Okay, you grow yeast in a culture with glucose, some other things. What do they produce? They produce alcohol. Is alcohol toxic to yeast? Yes. Okay, so eventually, some of you may get into the foray of brewing your own beer at home. Okay? It's not hard. it's not hard in terms of intelligence. It's tedious. Okay, you have to do a couple different steps. Blah blah. Add yeast, let it run, make sure it's at the right temperature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. But what's occurring in that sort of fermentation process is yeast are consuming the sugar that's given to them, the resources that are given to them. They're growing, and as they grow, they produce alcohol. Right? That toxic waste actually kills off the yeast as that production. All right? That can be applied to what humans do as in our population, producing garbage, and toxic waste, etc. Okay? But it helps to regulate population size. So only a certain number of yeast cells will survive as the percentage of alcohol increases. Predation. Okay? The interaction between different organisms, different species. All right? The presence of a predator will reduce the population size of the prey. The absence of a predator will lead to an increase in population size of the prey, right? Absence of prey, what effect will that have on the predator? Right? They'll decrease. So they're related in an inverse proportion. They're inversely related. Right? One goes up, the other one is down, and then the other one will follow, increase. Okay, territoriality. All right, this can limit population density when space becomes a limited resource. This may be dependent upon birth rate. This may increase death rate through fighting, whatever it might be. But it will limit if a species exhibits this behavior, it will limit the population density because they require so much space, all right, to live. Examples: the cheetah marking the territory, right? And that's a problem with cheetah because they are actually an endangered species, threatened species. Disease transmission. Population density increases. What happens to the likelihood of transmission of diseases? Okay, let's use your dorms as an example. When you came here last September, what were you used to? What was your living situation prior to coming to Springfield College? You were probably one of a few children in the house. You lived in a house or apartment of 3 to 5 people, right? Somewhere around that range on average. Now, you move to Springfield College, you have a roommate. You have how many people on the floor? I don't know. How many people walking around in the entire building that you are sharing that basic quarter with? Increase in population density in an area. What happens right around October of that year, of last year? Everyone in here sounded like Ashley. There was sniffling, coughing, sneezing. It sounded like a NyQuil commercial. Right? Because one person gets sick, they're in close proximity, it's easy for disease to transmit from one to another. Okay? Closer the population is, more easily the transmission. You can look at disease plagues that have occurred throughout history. Probably the most famous is the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, right? And that was directly related to population density, right, in London and in Europe at that time. Okay. Other intrinsic factors. Okay. Intrinsic factors that are related to whichever species we're talking about. All right. Some species are seasonal breeders. Some will not allow for breeding to occur. All right. So, for instance, bears. Bears have intrinsic factors of rearing cubs for 2 to 3 years prior to having another set of cubs. All right, another reproductive. That's an intrinsic factor. If there's too much population density, okay, they will not come back into heat in that time. All right, because they tend to be solitary animals. Hormonal changes, etc. What we're all talking about is these. Well, all of these things come together are called, and how do we study this? Population dynamics. Okay? This looks at the complex interactions between biotic and abiotic factors that drive changes in population. All right? And variations in population size. Now, populations can be relatively stable if they're successful. They can also fluctuate up and down around a certain stability range. Okay? Long-term studies have challenged the hypothesis that populations of large mammals are relatively stable over time. And we'll see this in a second. What does come into consideration for this? Weather, climate, right? Changes in climate are big influences on population. Okay? You have a natural disaster, landslide or a volcano erupts in Washington. Okay? Mount St. Helens erupts and covers 20,000 square acres of forest with ash. Within that 20,000, animals die, plants die. What happens? What has occurred? A traumatic event. Populations have wiped out. Okay? Birds, however, that could fly away in the area, they're fine. They can come back. Right? So that population doesn't change. But now there may be no food in the area. They have to go somewhere else. Right? You could wipe out a predator. You remove a predator. Right? Hunting of wolves in the Northeast and in the United States in the early 1900s nearly wiped them out. Okay? And in response to that, what happened to the deer population? Right? It spikes. It goes up. It increases because you removed a predator. That's an example of a fluctuation. Okay? And then you can see moose. Okay? So in this case, moose and wolves are directly related. Wolves will hunt as a pack and will take down a moose. And if that's the only viable prey for them, they are dependent upon each other. All right? As moose increase, the wolves, more food available, more reproductive success, increase in population size. It goes up. Now, too many wolves available, moose are attacked, right? They're killed, less reproductive success in the moose, population goes down, and then scarce availability of food for the wolves, and so sort of they follow in turn with one another. This is an example of fluctuation. Okay? Now, you could basically say that the population of wolves are relatively stable somewhere around the average of what? 30, somewhere around 28 to 30. Number of moose, relatively stable, probably on the average of 1,200. But that fluctuates up and down depending upon factors. There's probably a scale difference. What's that?
Why was it like 20 moose and like 1,000 wolves?
Metapopulations. How are they different from other populations? This is where you take into account immigration and emigration. Up until this point, we have disregarded that, right? The movement of individuals in and out of a population size. Okay? And you can have local populations, right, within a metapopulation which occupy patches of suitable habitat surrounded by unsuitable habitat. Right? So moose that are found, say, in the Quabbin Reservoir are They're a nice forest area for them to move around in, but around them is Amherst, Northampton, Worcester on the other side, Athol, all these sort of urbanized areas that prevent them from moving around. Right? There's an example of a meta population or local population within that population. All right. Questions on populations, and that finishes chapter 40, which will be on your exam. Will be your final on Thursday afternoon. Questions?
Just chapter
Yes.
40.